მოდელი საღამოს შემდეგი შეხვედრა ეძღვნება ამერიკელ პოეტს რობერტ დანქენს. ტარა მაგდაველი მკვლევარი ისაუბრებს მის მიერ დაწერილი წიგნის შესახებ The Householders, Robert Duncan and Jess. და ირაკლი ყოლბაია გაუძღვება შეხვედრას, რომელსაც დავასრულებთ დანქენის პოეზიის და ქართული თარგმანების კითხვით. თუ ქართული თარგმანით გინდათ ღონისძიებას მოусმინოთ, აიღეთ ყურსასმენები დარბაზის ბოლოში.
გმადლობთ. ესე კარგად ისმის. ესე კარგად ისმის. I shouldn't. Well, so how this is going to work, and thank you very much for being here. It's a great pleasure for me to be with someone who shares this love for Robert Duncan and his poetry and his poetics, and also for the work of Jess, who is those two as a couple and as individual artists are the subject of your book. The book is called The Householders. The Householders, yeah. She will shoot me if I get something wrong. The Householders, and that's that's the investigation. New, I think, I had a chance to read it. It's like a very vital rereading of the life and work of those two incredible artists. They are not a household name here, but I think your presentation, which we'll go into in a minute, will take care of that. And so we'll begin by presentation led by Tara. Then we'll just check time. If we'll talk a bit, I guess, and then we'll read. And how that will work is Tara will read one poem by Duncan in English, and then I will read the same poem in my translation, and then two other poems in Georgian. So that's it. I think you can take it away.
Thank you, Irakli. Thank you to Nuka and all the organizers. It's really exciting to be here and maybe introduce the work of Duncan and Jess to some of you. So Duncan and Jess were West Coast, San Francisco creative people. They lived there for many years together, and they are kind of like cult figures from the West Coast beat era of the 1950s, 1960s. The reason why we've got images is because this is a couple, and one of them was a poet and the other was a visual artist. And I'm actually trained as an art historian. I'm more of an art critic and art writer. And I first did my dissertation on Jess alone and realized at a certain point when I was thinking about the book that the greatest interlocutor of Jess's work was Robert Duncan, and vice versa. And that, in fact, if you put the two together, which no one had ever done before, that you could have an extraordinary conversation around the relationship between art and poetry, between the visual and the verbal, through this intimate partnership that went on for several decades. So that's I would say that's the method of the book, is to think a poet and an artist with and against each other. I'm just going to go through a couple images. So yeah, that's why I've got the slides, is because half of the partnership was visual, and so it seemed important to represent Duncan's poems, which we'll read to you later, and also Jess's artworks, and to maybe give a bit of introduction to them. So this is San Francisco in the 1950s, 1960s. Duncan was part of the Berkeley Renaissance and then the San Francisco Renaissance. He was very, very close with Jack Spicer, who you see here in this image, and other key poets of that movement. And in their coterie as well were artists like Jay DeFeo, who you see here. So this is giving you a flavor of like the San Francisco avant-garde in the post-war era. There she is working on her monumental concrete canvas, The Rose. George Herms, who was an assemblage artist and poet. There's some of his assemblage works. Bruce Conner, who was a filmmaker and artist and writer. There's a lot of working across disciplines in this moment too, and people are really working with like found material, like secondhand found material, like sort of salvaging stuff from around the Bay Area. Wallace Berman, who was a kind of shaman and polymath, and also a poet, he was a kind of key eye of the storm of this community. He ran the very influential literary magazine Semina, which might be familiar to some of you. Here's another portrait of Duncan and Jess. This one, they're a bit more stuffy. This is I'm just going to very quickly walk you through the chapters of the book, trying to unpack what some of the arguments are. The first chapter is really also takes its title, it echoes the book's title, which is The Householders. And, you know, it in some ways it might seem retrograde, but for Jess and Duncan, the idea of home or the household became this radically important site of creativity and creative production. And so I think the key argument of the book, if I could have you take away anything, is something like domestic space can be a site of creative production. And that for these two artists, this poet and this artist, it became the foundational holding structure, what, you know, like a kind of safe space in an era of cold and night, in a post-war America in which their relationship was illegal. It was an open secret, you know, their homosexuality was open to their kind of domestic coupledness was an open secret amongst their friends, but it was not something that could be declared or made official in any way. So it's like a kind of a gesture to make a home together that is a physical place, but also a conceptual site, right? A site of like world building and creativity and being held, what it might mean to be held in one's creative pursuits. That was the sort of both radical and retrograde aspect of their home, what they created. This is this great quote by Duncan, which I just returned to again and again as I was thinking through the book. The household Jess and I have seen as a lone holding in an alien forest world, as a campfire about which we gathered in an era of cold and night, a made-up thing in which participating we have had the medium of a life together. So the household becomes a medium, you know, and I think he's really using this word in English for its connotations of sculpture is a medium, poetry is a medium, painting is a medium. It is the form through which you can have a life together. So here are some of the houses that they lived in, this old decrepit San Francisco house. There's another one on Baker Street. They lived in Stinson Beach for a time, which was a beautiful seaside town on the Pacific Ocean. Black Mountain College where you know, in the 1950s and 60s, an incredibly important site of art and poetry in America. And then eventually they settled in this old Victorian in San Francisco, and these are some shots of the interior. This is their window shade, which was featured Alice B. Toklas and Virginia Woolf, who were like mentor figures for them, like a same-sex, older generation same-sex creative couple who equally took a domestic space and made it their own, let's say. Yeah, sorry, Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. This is Jess's studio, which, you mean, these are like deep accumulation of appropriated images. They were both avid collectors. They had 5,000 books, 5,000 records. There was a sense in which the house was like a bit of horror vacui, like there's this too muchness of this sense of what gets collected in the home, but also the home becomes the repository for all the things that they saved and salvaged in the world. This is an image by Jess. It's a portrait of Robert Duncan, and you can see how he images Robert Duncan with all of these faces around him. So you can recognize maybe there's Freud in there, Charles Baudelaire, Shakespeare, who was mentioned in the last session, Edith Sitwell, a number of different precedents that were so important to Duncan. Duncan is a poet who is constantly finding ancestors, constantly seeking to make genealogies. This is a really important queer gesture also, because it's a gesture in which if your biological family is unsatisfying or even rejects you, you can make your own ancestors. You can seek out your own genealogies. And this idea of queer ancestry or queer family is, I think, something that is fundamental to Duncan, and to Jess as well. But in Duncan's case, it often becomes kind of overwhelming. There's this way in which he gets swamped by these, he's almost like drowning in this sea of influence, let's say. And then just to say that Jess and Duncan every once in a while collaborated. For example, Jess would illustrate posters for Duncan's readings. This is an example. And Jess often uses, like I said, he's a collagist. He's using found material, usually found images that are much older, from like 19th century. The second chapter of the book is a deep dive, like a kind of close read of their one collaborative work, which was an early book of poems by Duncan called Caesar's Gate, which, interestingly, it's about this gate between the Caucasus and the Persian Empire to the east. And historians think that this is Derwent in Dagestan, which is an interesting connection from San Francisco, 1950s, to Georgia, to this region. So for this book, Jess provided the images, the collages, and then the poems on the facing page are by Duncan. So I was really interested in how you have literally facing pages where the book comes together and the artwork meets the poem, and how do you read them together? How do you compare them? How do you understand the collaboration as functioning in this couple? Interestingly, they walked away from this idea of collaboration, and they didn't really collaborate ever again. So this chapter is about collaboration as a failed experiment, which, like, everyone always assumes that collaboration is a good thing. But in their case, I think for them it was like, we're going to pursue separate creative paths, but the ultimate, the big collaboration, the grand collage, as they described it, was the household, right? So we might think, even though one is making art and one is making poetry, and they're basically separate from this point, from this early point, that this cultivation of the household as almost like a creative work in and of itself, like I said, a physical but also a conceptual site, that is the legacy of collaboration that they work on together. And soon after this period, which they wrote this book in Mallorca. They were doing a residency with Robert Creeley there. And soon after this, Duncan writes, like, arguably one of his greatest poems, Often I'm Permitted to Return to a Meadow, which we'll read in just a couple of minutes. Jess goes on to make extraordinary, just stunning collages from Life magazine, which was America's, like, suburban mom, it was like the magazine that everyone read in America. It was like constantly imaging for you what your life should be like, what products you should buy, what you should consume. And he just becomes like the kind of media editor of the American image regime for many decades. This one, for example, Cakewalk Princess, is using ads of cake mixes. Then the next chapter is about they both had, so as I said, they're not collaborating, but for many, many years, they both pursued lifelong, like multi-decade long, unfinished works. In Jess's case, it's the collage that you see on the left, which was called Narcissus, and was a lifelong exploration of the myth of Narcissus. He uses the Greek spelling Narcissus here. And Duncan started an extraordinary book called the HD book, which I highly recommend, which is his exploration of another poet, Hilda Doolittle, HD. There she is with her unofficial partner, Breyer, that he worked on for his whole life and was never published. It was only published posthumously a few years ago. And for both of these artists, artist and poet, I think what is the great unfinished work becomes like this extraordinary desire or wish for something to always be in potential or to have further possibilities. So for Duncan and Jess, they believe in the multiphasic aspect of meaning, that meaning is multiple and always multiplying. And for them, the world is full of possibility, and you would never want to, like the worst thing you could do would be to close it off by concluding something, right? So a conclusion becomes, or an ending or sort of tying something down becomes like deeply contrary to that wish of wanting the open form, the open field, yes, the meadow that you can return to again and again and again. And so it's quite interesting how they both continue to work on these projects for many, many years, without finishing them, that in some ways live with them in their domestic space. You know, so there's this intimacy, this intense intimacy and vulnerability of that unfinished too. Jess's work sort of is finished. It is in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. It was meant to be a two-part, and only one part exists, so it's missing its mirror half. If you think of Narcissus as looking into the, seeing the reflection in the water, it's like we're missing the reflection in some sense. And then Duncan's work was published after, posthumously, after he died. And then the last chapter considers their origin myths. So both Jess and Duncan cultivated, like self-consciously cultivated, really wild origin myths to try to understand, what it meant to be a creative person in an era of catastrophe and war and violence and authoritarianism. Jess has such an interesting formation. He was originally studying to be a scientist in California, and he was drafted into the military and was sent to Oak Ridge, where he worked on the Manhattan Project, essentially developing plutonium to make the first atomic bomb, which was dropped on Hiroshima on his 21st birthday. He goes to work in, I've got a picture here of, this is one of the reactors in Oak Ridge, and then he goes on to work at Hanford, Washington, which is the most polluted site in North America. So this was a nuclear production facility that is, essentially highly toxic. And so Jess had this moment where he was working in Hanford and decided that he was no longer going to pursue science, that science was made by madmen, and he dropped his last name, so that's why he's only called Jess. He was Jess Collins. He moved to San Francisco. He came out as a gay man in 1949, and he enrolled in art school at Berkeley. Duncan, for his part, was adopted by parents who were theosophists, and they believed that Duncan was chosen. They adopted him based on very specific astrological readings, and they believed that he was a reincarnated citizen of Atlantis. And so as such, he grew up in this kind of mystic house where he believed, where there were seances and there was this kind of deep belief in the spirits, in the spiritual realm, and it was imparted to him that in his lifetime there would be a great deluge and a great fire that he would live through. And so Duncan comes to, when Duncan and Jess meet, they come together with these quite intense origin myths that help them to navigate, like, what does it mean to build a world or to believe in a world in the capacity of people to come together and be in relation with one another and to build something together in the face of like total catastrophe. In this time in the 1970s when 1960s and 70s, when it's the Vietnam War, which was also mentioned before, Duncan is working on his late work called Groundwork, and he writes these Vietnam War poems, and he is devastated, and he's writing as a witness. He really feels like the poet's role is as a witness to stand before the war and to confront it, and to that there is a kind of continuity of war and a continuity of the poet as witness that he is just extending a long tradition of. So there will, for Duncan, he refused to call them anti-war poems, and he famously gotten lots of arguments with the poet Denis Levertov about this. He said they're not anti-war poems, they're war poems because war is a fact of human existence, and it is something that will recur again and again and again, and it is the poet's job to stand in front of it and to witness it for each age anew. And I thought of that just quite a lot, just thinking about what's going, the discussion around what's been going on in Ukraine, and how, here we are again, this sort of cyclical repetitiveness of what it means to try to be a human being witnessing your age, and what is the poet's kind of responsibility in that regard. So that's the book, that's the shape of it, and I think now, I hope that wasn't too long. It was like a kind of cliff notes of like a 200-page book. But I'm happy to have a chat about it now.
Yes. So.
You can put it back to one of their photos.
Okay. First of all, you ready?
Yeah.
First of all. Again, thank you very much for the beautiful book. It came out a few years ago. It came out like 3 years.
Yeah, 2019.
Yeah, which was centennial of Duncan's.
Yes,
yeah.
of his birth, yeah.
Yeah, so, of his birth. So that was a moment when, there was a beautiful moment for me when, I've been reading him for a while, but when people began mentioning him again more consistently, I felt. And this, I think, is a very beautiful book and a very necessary book. As you said, it's kind of crazy that there have not been a lot of studies like this, because that's somehow essential to the work, and also in response to the previous talk that we were listening to, where there was a talk on the idea of the different language, different identity, and in case of this artist, in case of, let's say, Robert Duncan, it's a very central, and the question of the other, it's a very central metaphor, and the masks, the personae that to a certain extent comes from Pound's poetics, and also the inconclusiveness of, like, as in cantos, he writes passages, he writes other kind of poetry that should not be finite necessarily, should not be concluded. And I really love this. It speaks to what you're telling us just now, but this fantastic passage, this is about Jess. You write, he took the image of America offered to him via Life magazine, Dick Tracy comics, and modest sanitary napkin advertisements, and remade it entirely, revealing its secret corridors. He was, I love this. He was the imaginary editor of the American image regime for decades. I think this is really really fantastic, and even simply the idea of revealing secret corridors of things that are evident become a central goal for both of them. And when you were speaking, I was taking notes, and especially what mattered to me a lot was, of course, this relates us to even the idea of the grand collage, but also the idea of the permission, as if, that you get from the stars to make your own, to make up your own ancestry and genealogy. It is fascinating because, especially because you spoke about Duncan's childhood and his kind of ambiance in his family. How interesting that this idea of remaking your natal chart or whatever is as if a bridge or a passage between the queer situation and the mystical and the magic, the marvelous that they both sought in life. So what do you think about that? And is that, I think that is very central to your book.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. They both believed in myth-making, storytelling. They believed in the power of old stories, ancient stories. They were both huge fans of fairy tales. So the realm of childhood, the sort of stories that get made up in childhood, that was hugely important to them because it was a made-up thing. And this becomes like a place of permission, exactly right, where in a world that does not welcome you, you can make up a thing, you can make up your own world, right? And I think the other thing is that even while they are generating genealogies and generating communities, and they have, they have like really strong friendships that are kind of like non-biological families that they have in San Francisco. But even while they're doing that, there is a very strong insistence on the part of both of them that the poem speaks through them. For Duncan, he consistently said that the poem is unfolding through him as if he's almost like, and that there's this pleasure of witnessing that act. So he's not bringing the poem into being. The poem is coming into being through him as a vehicle for it. And Jess spoke in exactly the same terms about his own art making, that the image, he's just a vehicle through which the image comes to be and through which a kind of story or narrative or set of resonances, a presence, like he called it a dialogue of presences, comes to speak through the image, almost as if he is the, nothing but the vehicle through which that happens. And I do think that is a crucial, and I know lots of other creative people in the 20th century say a similar thing, but I think for these two, it was a crucial way of understanding their world as bigger than them, that they are just part of this, as you say, grand collage, great tapestry, this idea of something bigger than them and bigger than their ego. And I think that was extremely compelling as a way to live in the world, in a world where you felt like, as I said, in conflict with more hegemonic narratives.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was feeling how that relates to. I was thinking of how that actually relates to the tradition, the sense. You also spoke about the sense of radical and traditional coexisting, and it's very important because Duncan is very much and Jess also very much the artists of tradition. And the idea of it's almost almost in the sense of like Alcheringa that Robert Duncan often writes about, almost in the sense of dreamtime, as in like Australian lore, in the idea of like ancestry coming through you. But now that's, let's say, that's the ancestral part of it, and the radical part of it will be that for Duncan and Jess, they do not have a solid genealogy for them anymore. It's a malleable, fluid thing, as if, right?
Yeah, and I do think that's exactly right, and in some ways it is quite retrograde. I mean, they are insistently self-described romantics.
Yes.
You know, and in some ways, Duncan's poetry is kind of out of style.
Oh, yes.
In some, yeah. And Jess's work in a way too. But I think that it is fascinating to think it's a kind of appropriation of the bourgeois, you know, heteronormative home. They appropriate it, they occupy it, and they torn it, or they use it and remake it into what will work for them. And you know, I think home, we were talking about home as the theme of the last panel. It's, for each one of us, it's going to be a site of conflicting arrangements. You know, it's going to be a site of ambivalence, and you know, that seems true to the concept and true to the lived experience. And I think that they're absolutely, the radical and the retrograde coexisted in their household.
Yes, in a way that kind of further relates them to the Romantics. So the interesting thing for me, when you were presenting your book, you mentioned you even like spoke the phrase "the made thing." So the made thing, which then comes back in, often I'm permitted to return to the meadow, the famous poem that you mentioned that we're going to read, and also the idea of permission, that this poem opens his collection, The Opening of the Field, right? Which you also spoke about it, The Open Field, and it's the book that comes out in 1960 and kind of launches his visionary career, although he has been working for many years already, and this it's very moving to me that this moment of initiation is expressed in terms of. For me, it's almost a poem that seeks shelter, or the poet therein seeks a warmth, a warm spot where he can be permitted to return, and he speaks of permission. It's very important. I mean, I think one difference that you underlined, the difference between many 20th century poets and Duncan, the poets before him, that he, as you said, he has this idea of the derivative poet, and he has this idea of like having the like father figures, mother figure, H.D. is a mother figure, Pound, and some others are Williams, Eliot. He speaks of all those people, and I think one interesting difference between him and someone like Charles Olson, someone like Ezra Pound, is that he actually as if really begins to try to dissolve the genius at the center of this symposium of the whole. Is of course, like all of those poets were interested in grand collage and kind of inclusion of many different voices, but now in this case it's as if like this edifice that was holding it together may crumble because it was false, because I mean his queerness, etc., give him permission to think about that. Although, as you say in your book, still he's, maybe unlike Jess, still he's someone who is both derivative and a genius. He thinks of himself in that way. Is that true? He still has this genius idea.
Yeah. Well, I think he absolutely does insist that he's a derivative poet, right? So he's not original, he's derivative. And he believes that he is just sort of pillaging from, from others. But he does sort of, he never effaces the ego fully. I mean, he believes that he recognizes the bigger pattern and is able to discern it and is able to kind of craft this grand collage, right? Like he can see it. He has the gift of that insight. Jess was also very similarly, he would describe himself as appropriative. the function of what he said his practice was salvage, to go out into the world and salvage what's been cast away, what's been the detritus, what's been devalued, what's been considered to be trash. In this way, he's a bit more like a Walter Benjamin kind of rag picker figure. He has a beautiful line, an appropriated line from the great essayist Michel de Montaigne. So this is Jess quoting Montaigne, who wrote, I've gathered a posy of others' flowers, and nothing but the tie that binds them is my own. So it's this sense of there is nothing there that is mine except the tie going around these gathered up fragments. But again, I truly think with any kind of creative biography or creative work, we have to it's much more interesting to make space for that ambivalence between insisting that one is derivative and also insisting that one is believing in your own in your own project, let's say.
Yeah, because I was thinking in visual art you can conceal the eye, but in terms of Duncan, which is very interesting, I think in his later work that you mentioned, groundwork, I always feel he becomes much more personal. He speaks a lot about his pain of his sickness, his feeling that he will be removed from Jesse's presence, etc., by death, and so on. But it's as if in Duncan's sense, I think it's very important that he never kind of eschews the presence of the self, the I, and it's as if the tie that binds the thing is I. That's kind of what it is.
Yeah, that's a lovely way to put it.
You want to move to the reading? Because we mentioned the made place and place of permission, and if you would.
Okay. Often I am permitted to return to a meadow, as if it were a scene made up by the mind, that is not mine, but is a made place, that is mine. It is so near to the heart, an eternal pasture folded in all thought, so that there is a hall therein that is a made place, created by light, wherefrom the shadows that are forms fall. Wherefrom fall all architectures I say are likenesses of the first beloved, whose flowers are flames lit to the lady. She, it is queen under the hill, whose hosts are a disturbance of words within words that is a field folded. It is only a dream of the grass blowing east against the source of the sun in an hour before the sun's going down, whose secret we see in a children's game of ring around of roses told. Often I am permitted to return to a meadow as if it were a given property of the mind that certain bounds hold against chaos, that is a place of first permission, everlasting omen of what is.
მე წავიკითხავ იმავე ლექსს ქართულად, ჩემს თარგმანს. აღარ წარვადგენ, რადგან ძირითადად ამ ლექსის გარშემო ტრიალებდა საუბარი. ხშირად მეძლევა ნებართვა დაუბრუნდე მდელოს, თითქოს სცენა იყოს გონით ნაგები, რომელიც არ არის ჩემი, მაგრამ ქმნილი ადგილია, რომელიც ჩემია გულთან ისე ახლოსაა, საბალახო მარადიული, ყოველ ფიქრს შერეკილი ისე რომ დერეფანია მასში, რომელიც ქმნილი ადგილია, სინათლით შექმნილი საიდგანაც ჩრდილები, რომლებიც ფორმებია ცვივა. საიდგანაც ცვივა ყოველი არქიტექტურა, რაც მე ვარ, ვამბობ არიან პირველ სატრფოს ხატება, რომლის ყვავილებიც ალებია, დანთებული ქალბატონისთვის. ეს ის არის დედოფალი მთის ქვეშ, რომლის ლაშქრებიც რღვევაა სიტყვათა სიტყვებში, რომელიც მდელოა ბურული. სიზმარია მხოლოდ ბალახის აღმოსავლეთით ბერვის მზის პირველ წყაროს წინააღმდეგ მზის ჩასვენებას ერთით ნაკლულ საათში, რომლის საიდუმლოსაც ბავშვების თამაშში ვხედავთ, რგოლისა ვარდთა წრეებს რომ უთქვამთ. ხშირად მეძლევა ნებართვა დაუბრუნდე მდელოს თითქოს გონების მინიჭებული ქონება იყოს რაღაც საზღვრები რომ აკრავენ ქაოსს რომელიც არის პირველი ნებართვის ადგილი უსასრულო მომასწავლებელი იმისა რაც არის Okay, and so I'll read the other one now. ახლა შემდეგი ლექსი დღეს ჩვენთან ერთად უნდა ყოფილიყო დათო ბარბაქაძე, რომელიც ჩემი ცოდნით არის პირველი ადამიანი, ვინც ქართულად თარგმნა რობერტ დანკანის პოეზია. და გამოსცა თორცდები 2000-იანი წლების დასაწყისში გამოიცა ამერიკული პოეზიის ანთოლოგია, რომელშიც შესული იყო რობერტ დანკანის ლექსები, ჩარლზ ოლსონის ლექსები და ფრენკ ოჰარა, ჯონ ეშბერი, რამდენიმე ისეთი პოეტი, რომლებიც შემდეგ აი რომლებიც პირველად გამოჩნდა ქართულ ენაზე და რომლებიც ისეთი რაღაც ცენტრალური ნაწილი იყო აი ამ ცნობილი ანთოლოგიის ახალი ამერიკული პოეზია დონალდ ალენის მიერ შედგენილი, რომელმაც რაღაცნაირად ეს ისეთი არა კონტრკულტურული შეიძლება ითქვას და სხვადასხვა ტიპის ესეთი უფრო გამორიცხული ხმები ამერიკული პოეზიისას მიიტანა მკითხველამდე. ეს თავად წიგნი არის 1960 წლის, როდესაც იმავე წლის, როდესაც დაიბეჭდა სწორედ დანკანის ის კრებული, რომლიდანაც ვკითხულობდით. ეს ლექსი არის, რომელსაც ახლა წავიკითხავ, არის დათო ბარბაქაძის თარგმანი. ინგლისურად ლექსს ქვია Poetry a natural thing, ქართულად პოეზია ბუნებრივი რამ და თავად დათოს სურვილი იყო, რომ სწორედ ეს ლექსი გაჟღერებულიყო დღეს აქ. პოეზია ბუნებრივი რამ. არც შენი ნაკლი და არც ღირსება ლექსს არც ერთი არ წაადგება. ისინი გაჩნდნენ და მოკვდნენ ისე, როგორც ყოველ წელს ხდება კლდეებზე. ლექსი ფიქრებით, იმპულსებით, გრძნობით საზრდოობს, რათა თავის მხრივ გამოიწვიოს თოკის კიბიდან უკუნეთში გადაშვების შინაგანი მოთხოვნილება. ეს სილამაზე სათავისკენ მიმართული შინაგანი ძალისხმევა დაქანებულ მდინარეთა საპირისპიროდ, ძახილი ჩვენ რომ გავიგონეთ იქვე, პასუხი სამყაროს გვიანდელობაში, პირველ ქმნილი გვინვა გრუხუნი, საიდანაც შეიძლება წარმოიშვას სულ სხვა სამყარო. ორაგული, არა იმ წყალში, თხილი რომ ცვივა მხოლოდ ჩანჩქერში, მე ბრძოლი უტყვი და ბრმად მოქმედი, ესაა ჩემი გონებისთვის შესაფერი ერთი სურათი. ხოლო მეორე, სტაფსის მიერ დახატული ლოსის სურათი, სადაც მიწაზე შარშანდელი უცნაური რქები აწყვია. უმწეო ლოსის სახიანი ლექსი ატარებს ახალ რქადოდებს, იგივე ოდნავ მომძიმო და ოდნავ ხვარჭნილი. ერთადერთი მისი მშვენება იქნებოდა ისიც ლოსი რომ ყოფილიყო. და დასასრულს რადგან ვახსენეთ I'm thinking maybe I'll read an excerpt from the 4 songs that the Night Nurse sang because that's very close to our idea of like the fairy tale that you were talking about, this revisiting childhood as a poet, or not your own childhood, but this like condition of being a child and marveling. Цели ლექსია 4 სიმღერა ღამის გადია რომ იმღეროდა, რომელიც შევარჩიეთ და ამით დავასრულებთ, იმიტომ რომ მასში კარგად ჩანს აი სწორედ ის მიმართება ამ პოეტისა ბავშვობასთან, ზღაპართან, ზღაპრისეულთან და ასე ვთქვათ მათი აღქმა, მისი და ასევე ჯესის აღქმა საოცრებისა სამყაროში, ასე ვთქვათ, რომელიც მოდის ბავშვობიდან. წავიკითხო მაშინ დასასრულს ბოლო ორ ქვეთავს. ხემარწყვამ დედა რომ იყო ჩემი, მომასხა მოლი, შენ ყვავილებრ წითელი ჩემმა დებმა არ მიციან მამა, ძებნადაა ჩემი და ძმა ვარ სახელით ქარისა. ხემარწყვალო შენი მწყურვალი ფესვით, გამოყვებე ჩემი სული თითქოს ხილი იყოს შენი. სუფრა გამიწყვეს სვიანი, ჰაერს მოსწყვიტე მშვენება, ქარის სიმართლე აქვს ჩემ ამბავს ოდენ. ხემარწყვა სისხლწითელო, რაც უწინ დედაჩემი იყავ წნელად მერგე. სიკვდილი მოვიდა, როცა მე ვიშვი და შენ ეზრდები იმ მიწას ახლა. მამაჩემი ლანდია, ქარი მეუფლება. გოგონას ძილმა უყოს პირი, ძილმა უყოს წაიღოს ძილმა, მამამისის ცივი ცრემლი ყინულის მთად ჩამომდგარა და ეძილმა უყოს პირი. დედის შიშმა ფეა მოიღო და ეძილმა უყოს პირი, აწმთელი სამეფო სიკვდილად წვება და ეძილმა უყოს პირი და ცისკარს გაეღვიძოს თუ ცისკარმა ნახოს, დღის უფლისწულმა გამოსთხოვოს დაე ძილის საუფლოს თითის დაკარებით თუ კი შეძლოს შეხება მისი. ამინდი დამალავს, ობობა დააბამს, ასე იმღერდა ქარი. ოიგერწევს აი, უჩინარ ძაფით გამოკიდულ კვერცხში, განიხვევა, ვერ ვიტყვის სამარიდან თუ ქვეშაგიდან, სამარიდან თუ ქვეშაგიდან. I think we can, yeah, I think it's high takeover, I guess.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for those translations.
Thank you so much.
I have to confess my ignorance. It's the first time I'm hearing about this also, so forgive me if I'm asking silly questions. So what I've heard in terms of understanding Robert Duncan's background, that some of the themes you're mentioning, that this adoption and the mystical environment, perception of world as a dangerous place from up, and then the queerness in the context of that time, all of that obviously is resonated in a themes of safety and the idea of a home as a safe place, as the invented place that they needed to feel safe, not only physically, personally, but in terms of creativity. What I wanted to ask you, do you feel, obviously the period that he was writing is a period of incredible changes, social changes on a world scale, and you mentioned the bomb and the certainties collapsing, and then it was very unnerving for many people. Maybe it's splitting the hair, but to what extent you feel that main themes about safety and certainty and needing some kind of boundaries to feel safe was a result of his personal background, of the sexuality, the upbringing, adoption, etc., or whether it's a perception or reflection of the time that he was writing and all the processes that were happening in America and in Europe as well. Maybe it's a splitting the hair question, but I'm just interested in your, in terms of historical context, how does that, in the times, if it impacted the themes, or whether it was a personal journey that was mainly conditioned his perceptions?
Thank you for the question. I think that the way you've just narrated it feels really right to me, that it's both an outcome of a personal trajectory and the conditions of the world in which this couple found themselves living. One thing I will add is that for Duncan and for Jess, the beat lifestyle of itinerancy and kind of, sleeping in different places and kind of being on the road, Duncan especially was found that to be a deeply unproductive lifestyle, and he says when he met Jess and partnered with Jess, they exchanged marriage vows in 1951, privately, just amongst the two of them. They couldn't get married. But he said that finding Jess made a householder of him, and it was the condition under which he could work. So it was the condition of production as well. So we can say, yes, it's a personal story. Yes, it's a response to the conditions under which they were living. It was also a response to the immediate, so national conditions, but also the immediate local coterie of beat lifestyle. But it was also, I think, crucially, that was the pinning down or the holding space of that household that enabled him to work, to sort of like sit down and he always wrote at the kitchen table, which is interesting, that's his domestic space. And so, it was that grounding that allowed production to occur. I think it's all of those things. I wouldn't be able to sort of tease it apart or give one more balance than the other. Yeah, but thank you for the question.
I guess almost as in the hermetic formulation that Duncan often uses in his poetry, as above, so below. We have the sense of as within, so without, as inside, so outside. Those things are really inextricable, I feel, for them.
Yeah. I think Duncan was also very promiscuous in the sense of like streaming energy. Like he was social, he was hungry, he wanted to be out with people, and so like having that safe space of return to Jess was incredibly important for him. He could go out and come back, and whereas Jess was something of a hermit, so they both had their own kind of ways in which that arrangement was productive for them.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so
very
much.
Interesting conversation. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
მადლობა ჩვენს პუბლიკას. 10 წუთში დავიწყებთ შემდეგ ღონისძიებას დიალოგი მედეაზე ანდრეას ფლორაკისთან და ირინე დარჩიასთან ერთად.